Hi, good morning, good afternoon. So lovely to be with you all. My name is Kulkarni, and I have the pleasure of being part of this keynote address with my colleague and friend, Cynthia Choi. It's just really such an honor to be part of Asians in Advertising, and I know it's been a wonderful day yesterday, and today has so much promise in terms of the various panels and discussions that are going to happen. Cynthia and I are going to start off today's conversation with just a little bit of our backgrounds to tell you about our personal journey that brought us to this work. So Cynthia, would love for you to get us started, to tell us a little bit about your early years and what really brought you to this work.
Yeah, well, first I just want to say huge congrats to the founders of Asians in Advertising, and talk about breaking barriers, coming together. And it's so great to see in the chat people joining from all over the country and the world. And I'm feeling the energy in the chat. And you know, Manju and I rarely have an opportunity to be in the same space talking about our own personal journeys and what brought us to this work. So we were really excited to accept and be a part of your inaugural summit. You know, we often talk about our personal experiences growing up as being one of the primary forces that shape us in how we see the world. And for me, as a daughter of immigrants, my parents came here in the 60s as part of the opening up of our immigration policies that historically had discriminated against people like my family from coming to this country. And having to navigate our public education system. My father was trained as an architect and could not get a job, actually, because of his accent and his limited English speaking. And so he ended up doing a series of businesses that were very, very hard as a small business person. And my mom coming here, you know, following my father, and we actually did have a period where our family overstayed their visit as students, and we were undocumented. I learned much later on. And my mother always has a saying that in the United States, there have been periods where it seems like immigrants have been more welcomed, and there were more pathways to be a part of this country, to be a part of this fabric, including being more civically engaged. And she often talks about how it's really changed. And we're having this conversation right now about how perhaps some of the ideals that we grew up with in terms of the founding of this country may not have in fact been the case for many of us. And so for me, I think that experience has really, again, shaped why I do the work that I do in terms of addressing gender-based violence, the experiences of immigrants, working with young people. And actually, Manju and I first met together. We have a long history and relationship and friendship based in our commitment and understanding of the intersectional forces of racism and sexism. And so we did work together addressing gender-based violence. And I know, Manju, you have a different story that led you to the work that you're in as well, which I think is really unique.
Thanks, and I did. So my family also was able to come to the United States as a result of the Immigration Act of 1965. I myself am an immigrant, coming with my parents in 1971 as a toddler, really learning to speak English by watching Sesame Street. every morning with my babysitter. And I think what's unique for me, or in terms of my experience, is I grew up in the South. Before we saw a lot of Asian Americans and Pacific Islanders, and I was always I was either the only non-white kid in my school, or one of a few Asian American kids in, a larger public high school. And for me, unfortunately, it was readily apparent from early on that I was different, that people didn't see me or perceive me as being American. From the time that I was in middle school, there was one incident where our class was playing Jeopardy in earth science. And I happened to be answering a number of the questions. And so another kid in my class asked the teacher, well, why is Manju getting all of the answers? And what he said to the whole class was, it's because she's not American. And so, at the time I just tried to laugh it off, but really, everyone in the class laughed and sort of in agreement, right? Like that I was not perceived as being American. In high school then, in my AP American History class, my favorite person who was my favorite teacher actually wrote me a number of recommendations for college, really sweet woman. She actually, in order to defend the Japanese incarceration, said to the class, if Manju, and there was one other student, if Manju, if we were at war with India, should we intern her and the other student? And 24 of the 25 kids in my class said yes. So that included a number of friends, white friends. The only person in the class to vote against interning me was my African-American friend. So there again, I understood sort of on a very personal level what it meant to be seen as that perpetual foreigner, to not be trusted, to be scapegoated. And the last story I'll share is just that my mother actually experienced discrimination when I was in elementary school, when she went to apply for a position at the local hospital as a physician. The panel of white male interviewers basically just had one question for her, which was, why are you foreigners coming to the US and taking our jobs? That literally was the question they asked her. So my mom and dad actually brought a class action lawsuit against not only those doctors, but the hospital system. And they had a lawyer from who was on the board of the Southern Poverty Law Center. And they were successful in the suit. And it actually changed the whole residency program in the state of Alabama. So I'm really proud of that and their courage. And really, what it taught me is that our laws can help redress some of the injustices. And so that's what really has kind of propelled me in my career, to see that, we do have a system of laws and policies that can be used for good. And I think that's what we're trying to do at Stop AAPI Hate. Sin, I wanted to just ask you to get us started, if I might, in terms of our work and our origin story with Stop AAPI Hate.
Yeah. So as you can see, Manju and my story, we have advocacy and in our DNA, and I think it's through our own lived experiences that really shaped us. But also the fact that we have dedicated our lives to working in a sector, the community-based nonprofit sector, that really has, I think, continued to ground us and inspire us in terms of what's possible, even with very little resources and attention. So our origin story is actually really simple. Like so many issues that go unaddressed by government, by institutions that have a responsibility for protecting our civil rights, for ensuring our safety, We jumped in when we started to see through media accounts, through social media, and through a case that Manju and her organization got involved in, which I'd love for her to share that story, started to see that there was unprecedented levels of hate being directed at our communities. And because we know the importance of data, and because we want to be informed by data in order to address racism, systemic racism, from interpersonal to systemic, we started Stop AAPI Hate, the first of its kind in terms of allowing people who were directly experiencing harm and hate to tell us their story. And so that's simply what we set out to do. And I mean, both of us have been floored by the response. And I think in large part because our community has historically been invisible and unheard. And it's not because we haven't been speaking out. It feels like we've been screaming into a void. And so it really is humbling for us that Stop API Hate has become this go-to resource in terms of what is happening to our community, the nature of it, who is being impacted. And of course, what we set out to do is to make sure that our data and our analysis informs policy and advocacy and really begins to debunk, I think, some of the harmful stereotypes and this dominant narrative that we don't face racism, that our communities, one, if there is even any recognition that this is the first time. Secondly, it's the nature of it is not so bad. And thirdly, that that somehow we are speaking out for the first time, and our only solutions are limited to hate crimes and policing. And so I can turn it over to Manju to talk about some of our core findings and, of course, what we're doing moving forward.
Sure. And as you alluded to, Cyn, I got my start in this work because of an incident here in Los Angeles. In some ways similar to my own experiences of being otherized, where a middle school child was physically assaulted and verbally attacked on the schoolyard. This was in February of 2020, before there was a single confirmed case of COVID-19 in Los Angeles and in Southern California. And basically another student approached him, said, "You're a COVID carrier, go back to China." And this child was really flummoxed and really didn't know how to respond. And so his immediate reaction was to just say, "I'm not Chinese." I don't think it was to separate himself from Chinese Americans, but to just say, I can't go back because I'm not from there, right? So he said, "I'm not Chinese." And when he said that, the other child punched him in the face and head 20 times. And so we sensed that this was unfortunately part of a bigger trend. And we were very concerned given what was happening across the country. We held a press conference in LA with our local leaders and worked with the family and the school district to make sure their needs were being addressed. And it was at that time that Cynthia and Russell reached out to me because they were seeking to really try to get to the bottom of what was happening in California specifically. And so together we approached the Attorney General's office to ask that they collect data, and they told us that they were not in the business of doing that and relied on local law enforcement. So we said, well, that's not enough. And so we set up Stop AAPI Hate, and we're really, as Cynthia mentioned, floored by the response. With little advertising or outreach, within 1 week, we got almost 700 incident reports from all across the country. That grew to 1,000, and then now we're at 11,000 from all 50 states and the District of Columbia. And in terms of our data for basically a 21-month period, we've seen that significant numbers are verbal harassment, also avoidance and shunning, as well as discrimination in the workplace, in housing, in retail. So when people go to buy groceries, pick up their refills at the pharmacy, go to big box retail stores. So all of that, of course, is really concerning. And, what you may have heard about is the physical attacks. And those have gotten a lot of the attention in mainstream media and social media. And those are really, really traumatic and awful, horrific incidents. Some of them, of course, resulting not only in injury, but even in death. Our data shows that that is a small minority of the incidents, and that only about 10, maybe 15% are crimes at all. So I just want to repeat that. So most of these are not crimes, and they're not hate crimes. And what that tells us is that we still have opportunities for redress, just like my mother did in bringing a lawsuit. There are state agencies that handle these. We have 3 bills in the California legislature right now to address harassment. So many of us as women in this country experience street harassment every single day of our lives. Also to address safety in public transit, and of course that discrimination in businesses. The other thing I'll say about our data is that 60+% of the folks who've reported to us are women. So, it appears that women in our community are bearing the brunt of this. And we saw the most horrific incident against women in our community, and that was the Atlanta shooting. So this is really, I think, spurred us to, begin to look at solutions and have an internal and external strategy about that. And I think, that's some of what we also wanted to share with you all in terms of what you can do in your ERG groups, what you can do in terms of some of the activism, because, I'll say that in the last 2 years, I've been really touched and inspired by so many folks out there. The ammas and appas, the nanis and nanas, the titas and titos who've gone out, some of them monolingual speakers, knowing though that they have a place, they belong here in our country, and they're going to demand their rights. So Cyn, what do you think in terms of what opportunities there are for folks? And if you can talk about sort of how we are building a diverse movement.
Yeah, Manju's so right. The past 2 years has been very traumatizing. We've talked about that as a collective, personally, the mental health toll. But what's been the counterweight to that is how so many people have stepped up individually and in places where they have influence, including Asians in advertising, to say, what can I do? What is my role in this? We are part of this racial reckoning, this national conversation about race and gender in this country. And so I want to just lift up that, this movement is not new. It's always been there. We're building on it. We're finally getting some attention. And we also want to just make sure that we continue to pursue opportunities to do this work with other affected communities, the Black community, the Latinx, Indigenous communities, immigrant communities, members of the MEMSA community, and also just to recognize that our community, Asian Americans, Native Hawaiians, Pacific Islanders, we are so incredibly diverse. And so this is something I think as the field of advertising, what I wanted to just offer when Manju and I were discussing what we were going to talk about today, which is one of the things that I think the field of advertising can do, and with your influence and your insight, is to display that diversity. We are members of the disabled community. We are members of the LGBTQI community. We are incredibly diverse in terms of how we define families. And so the power in that, and I think what's, just to get to the bottom line too, is that when people feel like that brand or that company sees them in their fullness, there is a positive association with that. I can tell you, when I started to see more diversity, more representation, it made me feel that much better about that company, including if they're socially responsible and they're doing the right things, in terms of workers and so forth. But just to be seen, especially because we have felt unseen and invisible for so long. I've been really inspired by the ways in which Asians and other communities have been organizing within their companies to create space to talk about very challenging topics, including, the rise in anti-Asian racism. And I think that that's vitally important, especially after these last 2 years. We felt so isolated from one another. And so I think this type of programming is vitally important. And to also make sure that it's not just a one-off. There needs to be sustained long-term conversations about what it means to address systemic racism. There are all kinds of studies now that are showing, for example, the barriers that Asian women face in various fields, including in tech. I imagine that there are similar ones happening in the field of advertising, whether you're a creative or on the branding or what have you. So I think that that's something that's incredibly important to lift up, and that it is connected to the systemic racism that Manju and I have been talking about. I can turn it over to Manju because I know we talk a lot about narrative change and the importance of partnership.
Sure. And I just want to express my appreciation for the chat. I mean, there's such a robust conversation there. And I think it speaks to the fact that we are all sort of experts, right? Like, it's not just Sin and me, but all of us have our lived experiences, and they inform the work that we carry forward, no matter what field we pursue. So even, in the corporate sector, in advertising, there's so many opportunities to really share that lived experience and create that sense of belonging, I think. One thing I wanted, while Sin was talking, I actually was looking for the ad that I saw this morning on Twitter. I think it was from Procter and Gamble about a young woman and her Asian name, and how she carried that. And she could have been otherized, but was really made to feel like she belonged by a friend on the bus, by her soccer coach, by even the nurse when she was born. And so, like, all of those different things, I mean, it was such a heartwarming ad to watch, and really speaks to the opportunities that there are for us. One thing I want to say before I talk about, specifically the field of advertising is, policies matter, and that, we want to make clear that much of what our community has experienced over 150 years is not simply interpersonal violence or discrimination, but also institutional. And that really creates what we know of as structural racism. We see that from the government side with the, as early as 1875, the very first Immigration Act in the United States that created exclusion was the Page Act. Folks know about the Chinese Exclusion Act, but it was actually a few years earlier that the US government forbade Chinese women from coming to the United States, right? Saying or alluding to the fact that they were sex workers, that they were dirty, unhygienic. So just imagine that. So that's sort of like part of what unfortunately is the fertile soil of xenophobia and anti-Asian sentiment. That's continued obviously through the Exclusion Act, Japanese American incarceration. There was also efforts against South Asians and Southeast Asians as well, in terms of the Immigration Act of 1917 that forbade all Asians really from coming to the United States until essentially 1965. And we know too that businesses unfortunately have had a number of practices that have limited our ability to excel in our professions, to use our talents and skills. And so I think that's why, to me, ERG groups are so important, because there's an opportunity as a collective to come together. So what I would say is that, when I think of that internal, external strategy, is to think of, how can ERG groups support employees? And Cynthia talked about this as well as, mental health support, a culture that really sort of identifies those barriers, discusses it, and even is able to bring it to management. One of the best webinars I did last year was where, the CEO of the company actually came and offered more than just a few words to say how important, even for him as a white male, this was. And he really, really wanted his, not only his immediate staff, but all of the employees in the company to feel like they belonged, and that they had so many talents and skills. So for me, that's really important, is to enable staff to feel self-actualization, to live their lives to the best of their abilities, and again, to use their talents. And externally, I will say, like that ad that I mentioned, it's so important, I think, to shift the narrative, to think about, often in the US, when we think of terms like the girl next door, right? For a lot of folks in mainstream America, they think of a white woman who's blonde, blue-eyed. Let's shift that narrative. Why can't it be someone who looks like Sin or like me or our daughters? When we think about beauty norms, right? What does that mean? So that it's, including individuals from African American, Latinx communities, right? Not just having, again, the stereotypical sort of bombshells that we were taught to look up to or to admire, from earlier in the 1900s. And also family, right? Folks in our families are disabled. They are, of different colors, different gender expressions, and bringing all of that into the advertising space, because what you all do is so powerful and so impactful. Hopefully you know that and you can see it. And just even in the last 2 years, I think seeing some of the ads and how they are much more inclusive than they used to be. It makes me actually stop, I will tell you, and rewind commercials with my DVR when I see something that includes a South Asian, right? Includes someone who looks like my daughters or my husband or me. So that's as valuable as some of the content that you see in the actual programming, because of the signals it sends. And, I'll just end with this one little anecdote that, we were so starved for representation when I was growing up, in terms of TV and movies, that literally, and this will sound ridiculous, when like on 60 Minutes or any kind of news show, when they showed poor starving children in India, we would still like glom onto the TV, even though it was an extremely negative depiction of India and Indians. So much so that's all the questions I got when I was in elementary school. It's like, oh, were you starving when you were in India? But that's what we would all gather around the TV, because it's like, oh my gosh, there's somebody that looks like us, even though that representation was slanted, it was horrific, it was not truly representative. And so I'm so glad that my daughters don't have to live in that era. And again, want to thank you for what you do to make that possible and really shifting and changing the narratives for all of our communities.
Yeah, I see such a lively chat, and I wondered we could open it up, and also there's been questions about how do you fight or combat tokenism? How do you challenge when you have colleagues perhaps who unintentionally are perpetuating stereotypes? And part of it is just accepting that we're all on this journey, and each company has a different culture. But I agree with Manju. The more that you engage leadership who set the tone, and you can partner with community-based organizations like ourselves. We can be the ones coming in to say this is something that you need to address, including companies. And so, but we could just open it up to any questions. Bernice, I see you on camera, and please guide us.
Absolutely. We had a lot of great questions, and kind of building off what you just were talking about. Something that we see a lot, kind of when they say BIPOC, Asians aren't usually included. How do we be a part of that conversation or kind of bridge that gap?
Well, I can just start by saying one, we just need to keep pushing for that inclusion. Manju and I are very well versed with the fact that even with funders and others that we partner with, they often leave out our community. And so persistence, and you keep coming at it because, and I think that we also, as Asian Americans and Pacific Islanders, we also need to remove this sense that are we complaining too much, or are we being seen as too sensitive? We've also got to change our mindset to say, no, it's not. We are actually part of this diverse BIPOC community. We have different issues, and we need to demand that. And that's a shift in mindset as well. So it needs to be both.
And I also want to, call attention to your website and what you're trying to do there, and really give people the tools to go visit. Can you talk more about that?
Sure, I can take that question. So yes, we really want to encourage folks. I saw in the chat that one or more of you shared your incidents, and I'm so sorry. I just want to say it's really horrible when any of us has this experience, and really it is impactful. It prevents you from engaging in the activities of daily living, buying your groceries, getting your medicine, even buying toilet paper at the at Costco or Sam's Club. So these are things that I think for us, when we better understand what our community is experiencing, I think we can hopefully better inform our lawmakers, the media, and just the general public. And that's what we try to do through our reports. So I would encourage folks to go to the report page, and you can see the various reports that we've done. So the national numbers, we've also identified the impacts of specifically anti-Chinese rhetoric. We have a youth report where youth in our internship, they actually wrote a report called "They Blame Me Because I'm Asian." So really, in addition to that, we have a number of resources on our resource page. And one area which I encourage you all to become activated in, which is to go to your city councils, your local board of supervisors. We have a sample resolution that folks can use to basically just have a foundation in your community that says, you know what, we condemn anti-Asian hate and discrimination. And when we have those passed in all of the city councils across America, we can begin to take those next steps in terms of more substantive legislation to prevent harassment, to prevent discrimination. But we just need to know that our that their allies in other communities, our friends and colleagues are with us, And so that's why we think this resolution is important. And again, encourage you to check that out on our website.
Yeah. Is it okay, Bernice, if I also add,
Absolutely.
every time Manju talks, I get inspired by other things. So, one thing that I saw in the chat is like, how do we as a community respond to the fact that we have an issue of racial discrimination that affects other communities? And so that's why we have been very careful about defining what the problem is. So it's not just interpersonal, it's systemic. And the solutions that we put forward have to be responsible in terms of what is actually going to lead to meaningful change. And so we are very concerned that the way that we respond to hate and discrimination largely or historically has been through blunt instruments, through like hate crimes legislation or more carceral approaches, when we in fact are seeing through our data, and which is why we're focusing on community-based responses, civil rights enforcement, and through education. And so this is very much where we are focusing our efforts. And then one final note is part of what needs to happen is there needs to be more exchange with and across each other about what strategies are working. And so I've been seeing in the chat, like, going to your leadership. I actually think there should be a space for folks to come in and say, this is what's worked for my company. And it might not be like a one size fits all, but I think it's really important to have those kinds of exchanges, just like we do with other community-based organizations in terms of effective strategies. And I really encourage that type of community building, because I think there's a lot of exciting efforts that are being initiated.
So another question is, right now I'm feeling like, is it getting better? I feel like you can't really tell from what the news is. Is it getting better? Is it getting worse? How are we tracking currently with kind of the API hate crimes?
Well, I can take that question. And so what we know is it's continuing. We don't issue reports daily or weekly because we know that for a lot of our community members, it's not like, when you call 911 that you do it to immediately get help, right? They are, and, individuals who've reported to us have told us they want to be part of long-term solutions. And so that's where I would say that I feel like we've really built momentum as a community, right? Where last year there were a number of rallies across the country where people really spoke out against what's happening. I think on a cultural level, we've seen, the increase in diversity in the media, but also more resources being devoted to, journalists covering our communities. One point I wanted to make, Bernice, is that what our data really tells us are two things. Again, most of these are not crimes and they're not hate crimes. And so we really need more holistic solutions, right, to be really comprehensive. And that's why we have really a three-part strategy, which is community solutions and resilience, educational equity, where we're really trying to get ethnic studies in school, the K through 12 curriculum, and then civil rights legislation and enforcement. And part of why this is important, Cynthia made a really, really critical point, which is that it's when we have solutions, they help hopefully all marginalized communities. But I think we need to be really attuned to the fact that there is anti-Blackness in our community, and we need to work hard to fight that, right? For many of us, Toni Morrison, the acclaimed author, said in the 1990s that when immigrants come to the US, what often happens is, they see the racial ladder. They see that In America, whites are often on the top and African Americans on the bottom. And so people align themselves with the white community and really try to shun and avoid African Americans. And so we need to put a halt to this way of thinking, in addition to the model minority myth, right, which really has driven a wedge between us and our African American sisters and brothers, because we're a community like any other. We have struggles and challenges. And we're going to speak out against racism and discrimination just like they did. And many folks don't know it's because of civil rights leaders that we had the Immigration Act of 1965. They pushed for it. And that's why families like mine and Cin's are in the United States, and I'm sure many of yours as well.
I'm going to leave you guys with one final questions. What do you think we should do more of in the future, and what is not yet being done?
Well, I can start. I mean, first of all, I think what you're doing with this summit, creating our own moments, not waiting for someone else to do something, right? Which is basically defines like Manju and I's like journey. Like, if we waited for someone else to do something, to take the reins to do leadership, I'm afraid to think of where we would be today. And that's what really inspires me about our movement. I think building off what you've been able to do here, which is going deeper in terms of addressing the racism that you experience in the workplace and in terms of representation, I think that there's so much work to be done there. And so I would I would just copy this whole chat right here and just start like developing a work plan around it. I mean, the main thing is what I want to end with too is please partner with community-based organizations that are close to the ground, because we will be the truth tellers. And I think don't turn away. Now is a time to be even more engaged, even though this has been a very traumatic period and it has really hurt our mental health. The worst thing that can happen is to feel a sense of helplessness and hopelessness. And I think more than ever, we should really understand and appreciate that we need each other and that we can work across our sectors and across our communities. And just want to thank you for allowing us to spread our message that together we can create change.
And if I could just add one small bit to what Cynthia said so well, which is this is the time for engagement. And even for each of us personally, you know, how do we engage with our families on some really difficult conversations about anti-Blackness, conversations about what we've experienced? I think for some of us, you know, with elderly parents, we're just now hearing about some of their struggles with racism. You know, they would just tell us when we were growing up, oh, you know, work hard, put your head down and study. But we didn't know at the time that they had challenges. Perhaps we didn't share our own challenges. So this is a good opportunity for that. And, you know, civic engagement is so important. I just want to encourage everyone to take on those leadership opportunities, whether it's in your own companies or running for office. We need a lot more representation out there. Just want to remind folks, democracy is not a spectator sport. And so each and every one of us needs to be engaged. We need to vote if we can. We need to call our local and national representatives to say, you know, we demand change, and they'll listen. I'm confident of it if we do it in the numbers that we have and we show our strength moving forward. So just an honor and pleasure to be with you all, and appreciate this opportunity and look forward to working with you in the future.
Thank you so much. This was incredibly insightful and eye-opening and such an amazing way to start the day. Thank you.